So thanks everybody for showing up in person and online on this really cold, and I guess I was expecting more snow day, but thanks for coming in. I'm going to just introduce Dr. Jamey Jones. So he is, I've known him for several years. We've crossed over a couple different times in our careers, but he got a geology degree, a BS in geology from University of the South, and then his master's degree in geology here at the University of Wyoming, and that's one place that we crossed over. And then a PhD in geology at the University of Texas at Austin. He worked for a few years as a professor, and that's where I crossed over with him again. We worked together at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And now he is the Associate Center Director for Geology at the USGS Alaska Science Center. He is going to tell us about geospatial methods of mapping critical resources, resource prospectivity in Alaska. And really, really happy to have you here, Jamey, and glad you could make it online. I don't know if you would have been able to make it if you were in person this today. So
yeah.
Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Beth, for the introduction and the invitation to speak. Yeah, I certainly wish I was in Laramie. I have fond memories, and Beth is being generous when she says several years. It's been a while since we crossed paths in Laramie, and I haven't been back in probably 15 years at this point. We're also having a comparatively mild winter day relative to what you all are experiencing. So we'll send you some nicer weather here from Alaska. Yeah, so when Beth asked me to talk, I've shared with her through the years some of the GIS intensive work that we've done. I used to teach GIS in my first faculty job. And then of course, Beth really anchored that at UALR and obviously there in Wyoming now. And the real message is that geospatial science is foundational to the work that we do in the USGS. And it's only becoming more so as we're generating large geologic, geochemical, geophysical data sets that need to be integrated, analyzed in this critical mineral space that I'll describe a little bit about today. And so you may see the job announcements. I'm a hiring manager. I'm trying to build capacity in geospatial data science. And so this is a really good time to be in this arena. I think you will find your prospects for employment very good going forward, both in the private sector, in the government sector, state and federal government. So I want to give you a little bit of background because I don't know if all of you have a geology background. That's the world that I live in and the world that I operate in. So I just want to talk a little bit about why we do what we do, both as the USGS and as a society. Why do we care about critical minerals? I just want to step back and say, what are mineral resources? It's easy to think about them in the abstract, but they're actually real things that sit on the landscape and are vital to our health, safety, our economy, our standard of living. Mineral resources are basically occurrences of things that are of interest elementally, geologically speaking. We have native metals, gold being one of the primary native metals that are mined on Earth. Obviously, Alaska has a rich history of gold mining. We have non-metals. Those are things like diamonds, graphite. We actually have very modest diamond production here in Alaska, but we have one of the nation's largest flake graphite resources that's known. Right now, it's in the western part of Alaska on the Seward Peninsula. I'll show you a little bit about that later. It's probably one of the most exciting graphite prospects in the US, but there is no infrastructure to support mining of it. So it remains a prospect in development. There are also other types of ore minerals. Sometimes elements occur in their natural form, such as gold. Most times elements form in minerals. And so we need to find what we call ore minerals to extract, say, zinc or lead. In this picture, I don't know if you can see my laser pointer, but in the middle right are the ore minerals for zinc and lead, sphalerite and galena. Alaska happens to be the largest domestic producer of zinc. They have a mine called Red Dog up in the very northwestern portion of the state. The interesting thing we'll talk a little bit about supply chains, is that all of that zinc goes outside the US to be refined and processed, and it comes back into the US as a net import. And so we're actually import reliant on the zinc that we produce because of supply chain issues. And so this is a really complicated economic web. In the lower right, you see the ore minerals for one of the ore minerals for copper, chalcopyrite. Alaska has a known copper resources that are somewhat contentious because the development of new mines is a contentious issue across the nation, and particularly in Alaska because of other considerations on the landscape, namely fish, water, people, things that are also important. So why do we care about mineral resources? Well, whether you like it or not, you use a lot of mineral resources. You use minerals in your daily life. These are just some statistics that talk about our resource footprint. If you want to think about it similar to a carbon footprint, every year, each person in the US requires about 25,000 pounds of new non-fuel minerals. There's plenty of information about where these minerals fit in our daily lives, but they are foundational to our comfort, our safety, our health, national defense, you name it, minerals contribute to it. Most of the mineral resources we consume are not renewable. Certainly there are recycling streams. There are some metals that are more recyclable than others, but we cannot produce the minerals to meet our needs through recycling alone. We need new resources, whether those come from the US or elsewhere. We need resources to maintain our global standard of living. The global metals and mining industry contributes to the global carbon footprint. The number is about 8%, so it obviously has an impact. But as we work towards a carbon-free future and alternative energy sources, those energy sources and those means of generating electricity with a lower carbon footprint are even more resource intensive than some of the technologies we use today. So we're moving in a more resource intensive direction. At the same time, we're trying to reduce the carbon impacts of our resource development and production and incorporation into our daily lives. So there's a bit of a conundrum that we need to be at least mindful of, because the solutions aren't easy. If you think about where minerals sit in your hand right now, if you've got a smartphone in your hand, you're holding a device that has about 62 different types of metals in it. Speaking of sort of modern technologies, average American cars contain about 55 pounds of copper, but EVs require about 3 times that to run the electricity. Average single family home uses almost 500 pounds of copper, and wind turbines, which are an excellent source of alternative energy, low carbon footprint, require 3.5 tons of copper per megawatt generation. So again, these modern technologies are really important, and we are deciding as a society to move in that direction, but they have an intense resource footprint. You cannot build wind turbines without mining. You cannot build smartphones without mining. You cannot build electric vehicles without mining. And that is foundational to our future. And as I'll mention here in a minute, we don't have sustainable sources for a lot of these metals that we are dependent on today. If you look at this on the international scale, the UN has developed 17 sustainable development goals to ensure health and prosperity for the global citizenry. Many of these sustainable goals are underpinned by mining. Mining is foundational to provide electricity to rural communities, bush communities, remote communities all over the world, Alaska included. As population increases across the world, there is an expectation that access to clean water, clean power, clean water, healthy food, etc. There's an expectation that opportunity exists for more and more people, and that creates more and more of a resource need. As the standard of living increases around the world, the resource footprint that we have baked into our society becomes baked into those other societies. And so there's a global need for these resources, not just a domestic US need for these resources. Some of the global population projections are staggering. We just crossed 8 billion, I think. We're projected to be 8.5 billion by 2030. And there is a mineral consumption footprint that goes directly with those increases in global population. There's a staggering, this statistic always blows me away. If you think about China and concrete, you don't necessarily think about concrete as a mineral resource. It is an industrial mineral resource. It does rely on geologic underpinnings. In 3 years, China consumed as much concrete as the entire United States did during the 20th century. 3 years, China used as much concrete as the US did in the entire 20th century. And those trends are just going upward. You could probably say the same things for India. It's a little bit behind China in terms of development, but its population is growing and development continues. So these are global issues. We obviously have important needs at home, but there are other considerations for where these resources are needed and the supply that is required to sustain these developing trends. If you just look domestically, you've probably seen in the news, we're seeing mandates for electric vehicles, where California has created a mandate where gas-powered automobiles should be phased out. I think 2035 is the number. We had the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed last year that provides staggering resources to support energy transformation across the nation. We're seeing tax incentives for EVs and domestically produced EVs and battery components. We do not presently have the resources to meet these mandates. This is a problem. We're seeing legislation tell us what we need to be doing, but we don't have the resources available to fulfill the anticipated needs. Importantly, it takes about, in best case scenario, it takes about 30 years from new discovery to permitting or to development of a mine. And so we might even be 3 decades out from the solutions to these problems, but these mandates are telling us that we need these resources today. And so that's a big problem. So it's not to say that there aren't resources available on the global scale. The challenge is that the United States, despite our complex geology, there are many elements for which we are import reliant on. This graph, this information is all published by the USGS National Minerals Information Center. But in 2021, imports made up more than a half of US apparent consumption for 47 non-fuel mineral commodities, and we were 100% net reliant on 17 of those commodities. If you look at the map on the lower left, you can see some of our major trading partners. It's no surprise that China shows up in the darkest red because they have a resource-intensive economy, and they are a major supplier for many of the commodities that we rely on. Of course, we have neighboring countries like Canada and Mexico, who we are stable trading partners with. There are many other countries around the world that we have stable trade relationships with. So it's not to say that import reliance is necessarily a problem, but there's really important consideration of where these commodities are coming from, and can we ensure sustained supply of the material that we require in the US, particularly in the manufacturing sector. That's why there's this emphasis today. The National Minerals, the Energy Act of 2020 asked the USGS, actually didn't ask, they demanded that the USGS produce a list of critical commodities that can be the focus or should be the focus for new research and investigation of domestic supplies. And so critical minerals were defined as those that are essential to the US economy and national security, that have a supply chain that is vulnerable to disruption and that serve an essential function in the manufacturing or product. So these are things that are vital to sectors that are nationally important. Of course, national defense is at the top of that list, but there are so many other technologies, particularly advanced technologies, that are really dependent on these materials. The first USGS published the first list of 35 minerals in 2019. That list was revised just last year or 2 years ago. It contains 50 different commodities. It's a bit deceiving. They actually broke the rare earth elements out into their individual elements. They also did the same for the platinum group elements. But now this notion of critical minerals is really driving a lot of investment in new research in the United States. And that research is happening in Wyoming. The Wyoming State Survey is benefiting from a program that I'll talk about here in a little bit that's being funded by the USGS under some of these mandates. In terms of prioritizing the emphasis on critical minerals, the National Minerals Information Center is trying to look at a bunch of different ways of determining criticality. This isn't so geospatial. I'll get into the geospatial stuff in a minute, but it really is vital to understanding we don't have infinite resources. We don't have infinite people power. So we have to figure out how to strategize. And later I'll show you how we're using geospatial technology to strategize our work in this arena. But this diagram shows sort of a concept of criticality. What are the minerals? What are the elements that have the most potential to be disrupted? And how vulnerable is the economy in that space? And you'll see on this diagram, it's probably hard for you to see on the board there in the classroom, but gallium and cobalt stick out like a sore thumb in the upper right of the diagram. And cobalt is an interesting one. Most of the global production of cobalt is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo right now. It has problematic aspects to it because there are serious social justice issues associated with that cobalt production. There's a resource, there's a district in Alaska called Ambler that is now It's basically a copper and gold prospect, but they're talking about the fact that they also have a cobalt resource. And so they're trying to use that cobalt potential to, say, elevate their stature in the discussion of permitting here in Alaska. So critical minerals are really starting to play into the economic landscape, although they may remain sub-economic in many places because they're usually produced as byproducts or co-products. They're not the primary drivers. It's still important to consider where we can recover them. And perhaps there are places that have already been mined that we can recover them from. So mine waste is actually of interest right now. There's actually a Department of Energy workshop just across the street here today that I'm sitting in on. They're looking at carbon ores. So for all the coal mining that's happened in Wyoming through the past, are there things like rare earth elements in those coal ashes that we can actually recover in economic quantities? That would be a great source of metals if we can recover them, if we can find them in significant concentrations. And if they're already part of a mining stream, then let's see if we can put in mechanisms to actually get those elements into production. So that's the background. Critical minerals is a topic of vital interest and importance to the nation today. And the USGS, as a science agency, was charged with improving our understanding of domestic critical mineral supplies. I'm funded primarily by the Mineral Resources Program of the USGS. And so our task here in Alaska, and we work with counterparts all over the nation, is to essentially look at these critical minerals in space, try to understand where they occur in geologic systems, and then to map those geologic systems and create new knowledge about where the critical minerals may reside. And then it's up to the private sector or other government agencies to regulate those resources, to potentially bring them into production. So we're sort of the first part of the web of knowledge. So I want to talk a little bit about how we go about this work, and here's where the geospatial piece comes into play. So this is a map showing the state of Alaska. It's a big state. We're a sixth of the landmass of the United States. We are a mineral producing jurisdiction. So we are one of the third largest minerals jurisdictions in the nation. I think we're third to Arizona and Nevada in terms of value of mineral production. Because of our size and because of our geologic context, we're a very complicated state geologically. And so that actually produces a diversity of mineral resource wealth that you don't see in a lot of other places. The Assistant Secretary for the Department of Energy just said this morning that it is known or suspected that Alaska contains 49 of the 50 mineral commodities listed as critical today, and that is true. That statistic came from us. We wrote that report. And so it's nice to see that information actually get fed up into the higher levels of government and used to tout Alaska's potential and the need to study these things more, because we say that and it's true, but we really can't necessarily tell you where exactly those resources lie. We know there's potential, but we don't know where those resources lie in the landscape. We don't know their geologic associations as well as we could. And so there's a lot of work to do. So we do have active mines here in the state. I mentioned Red Dog earlier. It's the leading producer of zinc in the nation. They also produce lead and a little bit of germanium. Germanium is now a critical commodity, and germanium production has not been a priority at Red Dog through its life, but it is known now as a critical commodity. And so they are looking at Red Dog's mine waste to figure out if there's recoverable germanium. They're also looking at changing the processing stream to perhaps recover germanium as a higher priority in association with zinc and lead. Two bedrock mines here in the central part of the state, Fort Knox and Pogo, both produce gold. One is a big pit in the ground. One is underground. Pogo's underground. There's a couple of mines in southeast Alaska down to the right. Kensington produces gold up north of Juneau, and Greens Creek produces mostly silver, gold, zinc, and lead as well. The diamonds show mineral prospects that are being actively explored and in some cases permitted. Donlin is currently in the permitting process to become a new gold mine. Pebble has a very contentious history. It's the third largest known porphyry copper deposit in the world, but it's sitting in the headwaters of some very important salmon streams. Bristol Bay down here is one of the largest salmon fisheries on Earth. And so there are some serious environmental considerations that have been used to thwart the permitting process at Pebble. And so Pebble is kind of off the books right now, but it remains a tremendous resource. If copper prices or copper need comes to a point where the need for that resource outweighs or tips the scales against the other environmental or social considerations, there's a chance that Pebble could be a mine. There is no infrastructure. Donlin actually sits on a river, a big river, so they can actually barge the ore out and barge diesel in to power the production. Pebble sits in an area that is completely remote, so you would need to build infrastructure to actually produce that resource. We also have a rich history of placer mining. Maybe you've encountered Alaska placer mining or Western Yukon placer mining on reality TV. We mostly produce gold, but there are also other things in those placers, those stream gravels of interest, things that contain rare earth elements, tin, tungsten, many of these critical commodities. So we're looking at all the different types of mineral deposit styles here in the state to understand what their critical mineral concentrations are. Here's a diagram that sort of expands on what I just showed to include not just the core commodities, but the critical elements they contain in association. I also show Graphite Creek out here. This is the graphite resource I mentioned earlier. Again, the largest known flake graphite deposit in the United States today. Graphite is essential for battery technology. So we're looking at graphite very closely. And Nome, the city of Nome, sits right here. The Iditarod starts here, and the Iditarod starts in about a week and ends out here in Nome. Here's Anchorage right here. The Iditarod goes across to Nome. There is infrastructure in Nome, but there is no deep water port. And so you cannot build a mine and ship ore out unless you can get really big ships in. And so that's one of the big problems with these. This isn't even considered remote by Alaska standards, but it does not have the infrastructure that's necessary to actually build a mine and sustainably produce this resource. So it's a really complicated landscape. There's a lot of potential, but there are a lot of challenges. And so our job as the USGS is to really refine our understanding so we can help measure the potential in a more meaningful way. And that's where our geospatial technologies come in. We also need to know where to spend the money. If we're going to make an impact, where can we go and spend non-infinite resources to make the biggest impact on our knowledge? So in comparison to the lower 48, and this is one of the reasons why we sort of are leading in this arena, we have incredibly rich geologic databases. These are geospatial databases. They're sitting in a variety of formats, but they're intuitively geospatial. We have a seamless digital geologic map database for the state that was first published in 2015. It's a compilation at 1 to 250,000 scale. The second version is presently in review. The second version revision is presently in production. We have a mineral occurrence database with more than 7,000 entries describing all of the mineral occurrences that have been documented around the state. So we know where minerals sit on the landscape. We even know some things about them. So for example, how much was observed, what was observed, has there been any past production? One of our most valuable data sets is our Alaska geochemical database. Geochemistry is foundational to mineral resources work because these are chemical elements. And so if we can find pathfinders or vectors to point us towards potential deposits, that's really useful for our workflow. So there's been a tremendous investment through the years in developing baseline data, and we have pulled that data into a series of databases so that we can analyze it in concert with our digital geologic map, our mineral occurrence database, and most other types of data that are relevant to this type of work. You may say, well, what happens with the lower 48? And I will respond by saying that this is not the case for the lower 48. It makes it simpler here because Alaska is a single jurisdiction. The boundaries are defined as a state, and we're a large entity. And so it makes it simpler. But in the lower 48, the programs that are responsible for doing these types of compilations are not the same program. Different states produce data in different ways. They map at different scales. They may produce their own databases. And so coordination and development of these types of digital geospatial data in the lower 48 is behind. We're actually working to change that through the programs that are active now. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. So Alaska leads the way, and we're trying to show what's possible if you invest in this geospatial infrastructure. And we're trying to use it to be really smart about the work that we do. So I'll talk briefly. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds here, but this is really the nuts and bolts of our geospatial approach to mineral resource prospectivity mapping. Historically, the USGS has produced what are called quantitative mineral resource assessments, where a group of experts look at the landscape and say, okay, we want to know about the potential for copper in an area. And what they'll do is they'll hand draw polygons around areas that have favorable geology or other characteristics that are deemed permissive for, say, a copper deposit. Then they will try to look at any production information from copper in that area. There are things called grade and tonnage models. And those quantitative mineral resource investigations are really important. And it's kind of been the bread and butter of the USGS historically. We've done these for all sorts of different commodities. We've done it all over the world. There's an assessment, there was an assessment ongoing for the moon and other non-Earth bodies. So this has been the bread and butter. However, in Alaska, we looked at that approach and said, if you just draw polygons around what we know, then what are we missing? Because I would argue in Alaska that there's so much that we don't know that we need to let the data tell us what we're missing. And so what I'm showing you here on the right, these are two mines, Fort Knox on the left, Pogo on the right. Fairbanks, the town of Fairbanks is just off to the left of the screen here. I'm showing the red dots are geochemical data points, samples that have been collected and run for geochemistry, probably by multiple methods. The background geology is shown there in sort of faint colors. And then there are these gray lines on here. These are watersheds or subwatersheds. We took the National Hydrologic Data Set, the NHD, and extracted the 12-digit hydrologic unit code. So there's subwatersheds that are about 100 square kilometers a piece on average. Watersheds are intuitive classification. They're intuitive for doing classification because they're continuous on the landscape. They're intuitive features. If you've got a stream sediment sample that you've done geochemistry on, ideally you're going to vector up that stream. And so watersheds are intuitive features on the landscape. And so what we decided to do was take all of our data and map it onto these watersheds, and then do some data-driven analysis, do some knowledge-driven analysis, and see what we come up with across the entire state of Alaska. So we took all of our databases and built them into a common GIS. We decided, okay, what deposit models do we want to go after? Because you can't, it's not a one size fits all. You need to consider the different things that match different types. Like a copper deposit is going to have a different signature than a tin deposit, than a platinum deposit. So we need to consider the characteristics of a deposit or a deposit group. We looked at our data sets and developed rubrics. Okay, for copper, what do we want to look for? Well, we want to look for bedrock that's igneous, things like volcanic bodies or intrusive igneous bodies. We want to look for pathfinder elements like mercury and arsenic in the environment, because those are usually signifiers of copper upstream or copper resources upstream. We want to look at geophysical characteristics that match copper bearing systems. And I don't want to go into the details, but we looked at all of these different inputs and assigned scores. And then we have a person in our group who's really well versed in writing Python codes. And he basically wrote a series of Python scripts to go through our data sets, look at all the scoring factors, do some additive analysis, and then map it onto these watersheds. So we took our databases, we made some decisions about what we wanted to look for, and we wrote scripts that looked for that information, and then we classified each watershed based on its score. So we came up with, there's 17,000 HUCs covering Alaska. And if you want to look at the output, here's an example. You take rock types over here, pathfinder elements in the middle, known mineral occurrences on the right, create some scores that relate to your perception of how these things might deposit type. And then for the entire state of Alaska, we classified every watershed based on we basically said high, medium, low prospectivity for that deposit of interest. We also tried to rank uncertainty because we kind of want to know how certain we are that a high is a high or a low is a low, or an unknown exists where there's no data. And so we just came up with a simple scheme to say, okay, well, if we've got 6 data sets and all 6 data sets are telling us that there's something there, then we're pretty certain that there's something there. If there's only 3 data sets, then maybe we're medium certain. If there's 1 data set, then maybe we're not certain, but that 1 data set seems really compelling. So there's definitely some qualitative aspect to it. And it's one of the things that's given the USGS a little bit of heartburn, because it sort of flies in the face of our classic quantitative assessments. But if you think about what we're doing, we're basically showing the entire state of Alaska and mapping the potential, qualitative perhaps, but still non-zero potential for a deposit of interest across the entire landscape. Okay, that was kind of a game changer. We published the first reports. I was the lead author on the first report and the co-lead author on the second series of reports. We published this first back in 2016. And we've done this now, I'll show you in a sec, for a variety of deposit types that are known or suspected to exist here in the state and that have associated critical mineral potential. So what you see here on the right is essentially the output from this GIS data-driven, knowledge-driven modeling exercise. And in this case, it is for rare earth element deposits associated with igneous, alkaline igneous bodies. You can see some distinct red hucks. Those are watersheds that have high potential for hosting rare earth element bearing deposits. You can see greens, which have basically low potential for hosting a deposit. What we really wanted to key on is the yellows and the oranges. These are places where the data are telling us something is there, but we have very little certainty. And so we said, okay, well, let's start drawing boundaries around these regions. And so we can define them into belts. These are associated with geologic belts that we know something about. And then we can look at these areas where we have some indication that something might be there, but relatively low certainty. And let's prioritize those for our new data collection. So this really helped us triage tremendous need with limited resources. And this is, again, all being done in a GIS environment. We produce fact sheets. We tried, we've been messaging this out. We're trying to get the lower 48 to engage in this type of exercise. This is being done around the world. You can find prospectivity maps for different styles for Canada, Australia, other important mining minerals jurisdictions. But within the USGS, this was really a first. And it's been incredibly useful for us, both as a way to understand our own data and its limitations, and also a way to, like I said, prioritize investment. We've produced these maps and data sets for a variety of mineral deposit styles, mineral systems. This is the most recent one that was released for lode gold. One of the things that we do is we package all the data that we use. I mean, the data are all publicly available, but we repackage it for the public to release with these publications. We also release the codes. All the Python scripts have been published. The idea is that if you, as a mineral exploration company or a land manager or just a member of the public who's interested in the mineral potential for a certain part of the state for a certain type of mineral, you could actually replicate our analyses. And if you don't like our code, you can change it and weight things differently, because you may find that every expert is going to have different opinions about what's important. So we tried to make this as open as possible. It's not to say that everybody has the ability to incorporate Python codes into their GIS, but there are certainly some people that can. It also makes it open source. I mean, you could use QGIS to produce these results just as you could use ArcGIS Esri products. So we think we've done Alaska a big service. The other thing that we really want to do is, because we've built these models, we want to use them. As we generate new data, the idea is to rerun the model. What did we learn? We spent 10 years collecting data in this region. Did the hucks change colors? Did the watersheds change colors when we rerun the analyses using new data? Ideally, we'll take stuff off the map by saying, okay, we thought it had high prospectivity, but we produced more data and now it's been lowered because now we know more. Or we'll see some new things pop up that we didn't know anything about before. So we want this to be a dynamic way for us to constantly assess what we're doing. And again, this is all being done in a GIS environment. So how do we collect all this new data? Well, there's a new program that was started in around 2018, 2019 called the Earth Mapping Resource Initiative. Congress essentially gave us a $10 million check for 10 years to say, we want state-of-the-art data for the nation in the critical minerals arena. This was a big lift. Murray Hitzman, who used to be the associate director for the USGS at the time, this was his vision. He basically convinced Congress that the state of our data pales in comparison to many third world countries. There are countries in Southern Africa that have better geophysical data than we have for the United States. And so Congress came through and said, okay, well, here's a new program. Here's money to collect new state-of-the-art data for mineral resource investigations, particularly in critical minerals. We want you to do this in partnership with the states. So state surveys have been key partners from the start. Wyoming State Survey is one of our better partners in the Western region. Colorado State Survey is the same. Colorado and Wyoming have active projects today that are being funded by Earth MRI. The bipartisan infrastructure law that came through last year added another 64 million for 5 years that basically supercharged this initiative. And that money is all going out the door to state surveys to collect new data. The initial mandate was to develop a list of critical minerals, and then it was to develop a plan for improving our understanding of domestic supplies. So all of this money is devoted to this effort. And so we're producing data at unprecedented levels, and with unprecedented amounts of data comes unprecedented problems managing and using said data. So again, GIS comes into play. So if you look at the state of the art at the beginning of Earth MRI, this was the map on the lower left of the extent of modern high resolution airborne geophysical data. Airborne geophysical data are really important for mapping bedrock geology at regional scales, particularly in areas that are under cover. In the middle, you see the state of geologic mapping at suitable scales across the nation. You should notice that Alaska has the least among all the states, and that's really a function of our size and remoteness. You can look at the coverage of modern elevation data, LIDAR being the modern elevation standard in the lower 48, IFSAR, interferometric synthetic aperture radar being the standard 5-meter DEMs in Alaska. This map is almost completed. We've almost completed full coverage of the entire US in LIDAR. And that's just, that itself is a huge step forward for a variety of uses. If we consider Alaska, again, we had to say, where do we start? What do we need to learn? And so we took these prospectivity maps and developed a series of what we call focus areas, areas that have some potential for resources of interest. And we said those focus areas are where you should start looking if you want to investigate resource X or Y or Z. We mapped these mineral systems we mapped all the mineral systems that we know of for the entire state, again, in a geospatial environment. And so these are the maps that have been produced in a series of reports by myself and my colleagues here at the Alaska Science Center. Here on the right is all the different things that we think we have potential for. And so we've created maps these on the landscape. The same has been done for the lower 48 by a working group of experts in the USGS in collaboration with surveys. And so if you look at the overlap for all these mineral systems, it's a mess. I mean, there are serious there are a lot of belts in Alaska that have potential for a lot of things. So you can ask yourself, well, what commodities am I interested in? Where do I have people on the landscape? What kind of expertise do I have? So where do we start? And so what we did, again, using GIS, we said, well, let's start mapping overlap. Let's basically classify this. These are our 1 to 63,000 scale quadrangles, which is our base quadrangle in comparison to the 1 to 24,000 scale quads in the lower 48. Let's map these quads according to how many mineral systems they may contain. And so we essentially created a heat map for the state that shows that this area here in eastern interior Alaska is the brightest. And there are reasons why that area is the brightest. First of all, it has greater amounts of data because it's close to some of the few roads we have here in the state. The city of Fairbanks sits right here. There's 2 active mines, so there's definitely mineral history. And it also has really complex bedrock geology that creates the potential for a lot of different types of mineral deposits. So this area called the Yukon-Tanana Upland became our initial priority. And so the state of Alaska and our group has been working in this region for the last 5 years to basically mow the lawn, map this whole area at levels and systematic levels that are unprecedented. These are some other regions that are going to be of interest in the future. The Seward Peninsula is where the graphite resource is located. There are other 10 tungsten resources of interest out there. This is called the Kuskokwim Belt down here in southwestern Alaska. People call this elephant country because this is a vast area with significant potential for unknown discoveries. The Pebble discovery that I mentioned earlier sits right on the edge of the Kuskokwim Belt. It was only discovered in the last 20 years. And so it hints at the fact that there's stuff in Alaska that we just don't know about yet because we don't have the data to identify it. So this is what the Earth MRI program has been doing in Alaska. I have some of the numbers here for the lower 48 as well. In terms of the conterminous US, we've seen an additional 8% of the landmass covered by new aeromagnetic surveys, or I should say that it was initially 8% of the landmass was covered by modern surveys. Less than 2% of Alaska was covered by modern airborne geophysical surveys. We've increased that number 92% in the lower 48, almost doubling it. In Alaska, we've seen almost 400% improvement in terms of the distribution of high resolution airborne geophysical surveys. As I said, the state of Alaska is mowing the lawn by doing systematic geologic mapping and sampling across this region of interest. We've developed web tools that show where data are being collected. This is called the Earth MRI Acquisition Viewer. You could go to this viewer right now and see what's going on in your backyard or in your state or region of interest. This just shows the Alaska snapshot. You can usually access those data as well. If not from here, you can certainly get links to the state surveys that are producing the work. All of this data is publicly accessible because that is our mandate, to produce publicly accessible information. We are taking those data and trying to integrate and synthesize them at a regional scale. The states are really good at doing the detailed work. The USGS is really good at doing the synthesis work. And we're doing this synthesis work in a geospatial environment. We cannot afford to build these data sets in a vacuum. They have to be integrated into modern geospatial environment. We're finally migrating from ArcMap to ArcPro. We're using ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise to develop enterprise coordinated solutions across the nation to serve and analyze these data. I've got a person in my group that's really good at building web tools. So he built this web tool to provide a public facing means of analyzing and downloading data from our geochemical database. Some of these databases are unwieldy because they are gigantic. So producing web tools that takes and makes it available to the general public to view, visualize, manipulate, and then take home, download, that's essential to our mission. So we're really focused now, not just on data development and data integration, but data delivery in modern ways. So we're building tools for BLM. Our land manager partners want to know, okay, we've got this area of land that we're managing. We want to know if there's mineral potential. Can we take it off the table for potential exploration, or do we need to leave it open to mineral entry? And we can now give them modern data to help make their decision process informed by actual information, not just the sense of an expert sitting at a desk. So we're building tools for our federal partners, our state partners, private industry, et cetera. And this is the modern mission of the USGS, and this is a game changer because it's really a foundational step forward in our understanding. And I think we're creating a digital, geospatially centered platform for the future. So this is pretty exciting, and it requires people like you all. The hiring to do this is happening today. I'm putting position descriptions together now to hire data scientists. We're hiring more data scientists and geospatial types than we are geologists in some areas, because we recognize that we haven't invested in the sort of cyber infrastructure of this. So we're trying to address that gap. State surveys are also doing the same. They're recognizing that the workforce just isn't there to do the kind of integration and data development that we need. So this is a really exciting time to be in the geospatial environment. I won't dwell on the summary here. I think I've said it all. And what I just want to end with is this notion that, you know, Alaska isn't unique. We just happen to be sort of a contained space. So for Alaska, we can develop these data sets that speak to our geology, our mineral resources, our energy resources, our hazards. I've got a volcano sitting outside my window that I can see from here. And if I want to know something about that volcano, so that if it goes off, we can understand the hazards that it presents. We have earthquakes. We have permafrost that is rapidly melting because of climate change. We have water bodies that sustain communities and fisheries and all sorts of different environments. We should be able to take all of these data and integrate them to make our analyses and opportunities for analysis as rich as possible. And so I'm trying to push our group, the geology office, but also the broader Alaska Integrated Science Center, into this sort of integrated data framework where, you know, imagine a one-stop shop, a Google Earth style portal where you could go in and for Alaska pull out, I'm interested in how the bedrock geology intersects with the permafrost, intersects with volcanoes or faults or whatever. And that should be a few clicks of a button. It shouldn't be a rabbit hole. It should be there for everybody to use. And then those data sets should be as current as possible. So we're working on this. It's certainly easier here in Alaska, as I said, because we're a single jurisdiction. We're a relatively confined state. But I think we're working towards this to some extent at the national level. And so again, it's an exciting time. And this is all really, really driven by the types of technologies that you all are invested in. So I hope that's enough of an overview. I'm certainly happy to answer questions in any way about the science, about the practice, about who's hiring, all sorts of things. And I'm also a resource. I think when Beth asked me to give this talk, I probably gave her 4 or 5 names of people across the nation who are doing this work just like we are. This is a really good time, and I think that it's really exciting. It's a really exciting time to be here in Alaska, but it's really exciting time to be anywhere for that matter, because things are changing fast. So I'll end with that and entertain any questions or discussion. Also fun to do geology in Alaska because we get to fly helicopters out to places like study rocks that people just don't touch very often. It's pretty amazing.
Fly helicopters and dodge the grizz, right?
Yeah, that's right. Dodge the bears. And this is Redoubt. This is one of our volcanoes that you can't see it from Anchorage, but you can see it from a little bit south. And it erupted, I think 2010 or so. Redoubt erupted. It's the most recent big eruption in the Anchorage area.
Any questions in the room?
I have one.
All right.
Hi, Jamie. Thank you very much for the talk. It was excellent. I'm Leonard Carr. I'm an exploration geologist. I've worked on 5 continents over the last 45 years. And I left the US 30 years ago because it became impossible to do anything here. You couldn't get permits to do anything, so why bother looking? So I stopped looking here.
Yeah.
With that caveat, though, I think you're doing exactly what needs to be done to begin to build a foundation for maybe a resurgence or revival of the US minerals industry. But as you alluded to, the real headwinds here are on the permitting side. 30-year permitting kills you. I've known that for a long, long time. The general public does not. How do we overcome that? Because all the great work you're doing will be for naught if it hits that brick wall.
I know that's exactly right. In fact, I was just sitting in a workshop where the assistant secretary for the Department of Energy said that exact same thing. And he said, you know, we are not a regulatory agency. We do regulate some things, but we do not regulate the mining sector. So it's first of all, it's a dialogue about the importance of these commodities to our daily lives. I mean, that's something that I don't think is communicated well enough. I mean, if the social license to conduct mining in places like Alaska or places in the lower 48 has really never been that strong, and yet there are still industries that exist. But I think there's a bit of a disconnect between, I think the rare earth crisis that really precipitated some of this work about 8 or 10 years ago, it really put rare earth elements on people's radars, like, oh, if China cuts off the supply, we're screwed. And so I think, first of all, there's this need for communication at all levels and across all parties, NGOs, communities, the mining sector, the political sector, about the importance of this. I think creating information that lowers risk, that then hopefully generates investment in infrastructure here in Alaska. And then, yeah, so something within the regulatory side of the house, BLM is constantly criticized as Alaska's landowner. The state is open for development. And in some cases, BLM does stand in the way because processes are real. We are a regulated jurisdiction. And so you want to make sure that any mining is done in a socially responsible and minimally impactful way. I think I hear that dialogue is happening. It's definitely emotionally and politically charged, but it is the only path to progress. And what we're trying to do is generate the information that really outlines the potential. And then hopefully that leads to investment in the things that make the process work more efficiently. Because I think to talk about things in the hypothetical just doesn't get people charged up. But if you can say, for example, in the Ambler district of Central Alaska, we could actually produce cobalt in the United States, or in Idaho, the Idaho Cobalt District. If we can build capacity to produce cobalt in Idaho or Alaska, and we can get the social license to do so, and I say we in the general sense as human beings, we can make a real impact by taking that cobalt out of the DRC and other less stable jurisdictions. So yeah, it's an important and critical piece that we don't play a direct role in. But if we can hopefully give the BLM, for example, information to make their decision-making more effective, then maybe we can start to create a more effective narrative around the permitting issue. So that's a non-answer because there is no good answer.
Fair enough. Another question that is a little more technical, geophysics.
Yeah.
Are there plans to do any extensive coverage of the entire country using any airborne methods, deep seismic, TM, VLF, EM, gravity, radiometrics, blah, 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 you know, the litany?
Yeah, there is. In fact, I could show you the acquisition viewer, but I don't have the time or access to it right now. But yeah, across the nation, there is a major investment in collecting high quality airborne magnetic data. We call it, our geophysical colleagues in Denver did a ranking that they published in EOS a number of years ago. We're collecting rank 1 highest quality airborne magnetic data for as much of the nation as we can. We're basically mowing the lawn, starting in areas with mineral potential first. We're collecting radiometric data on top of that. We are doing some select EM surveys in places, particularly where there's graphite potential. So there's a new EM survey going on in Alabama and Alaska and Western Michigan and Nevada. Seismic is something we're not doing. There are certainly some geophysical methods that would be of interest that we're just not considering because the needs are greatest in those other arenas. But yeah, it's happening. The investment is it was on the order of 8 million a year. And now I think with the BIL funds, it's something like 30 million a year. So yeah, we're changing the game by collecting these data and making them available to anybody who wants to use them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, there are students in the room that do need to leave. For your next class, you may. But Jamey, thanks a lot for really, really interesting. I know I kind of got a look at, I think I was a review for one of the papers. And so this is great to see how far it's come.
Yeah.
Look at it. Well, we'll have to get you here on campus.
I'm ready and willing. Let's shoot for the summer.
But it's a little bit nicer, yeah. When it's a little bit nicer, get you back.
Exactly.
Thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And yeah, for anybody who's interested, I'm glad to follow up. And if there are other places in the US that you're interested in, perhaps even in your backyard there in Wyoming, I can certainly put you in contact or give you the name of the people who are doing the work, because this is a national effort, a national imperative.
Right. All right. Thank you.
All right. Cheers, everybody.